My name is Mona. This is Saad, and with us as well as Amal. We're part of a collective called Decolonize Sudan. We are Sudanese Americans that are pushing for an anti-imperialist and anti-colonial advocacy to liberate Sudan. Today we don't only want to use this information to inform you, this session to inform you and make you better advocates for Sudan, but we also want to gather some information and we want to inform the work of Decolonize Sudan so that we can be better advocates ourselves. So we'll be providing the slides and the resources from this presentation to anyone who joins our collective. Please put your info on the list that we have right here. You can do that after the session or whenever. Emma can get us started with an advocacy exercise.
So first up, we have our advocacy exercise. So in one sentence, could you write down your understanding of what is going on in Sudan?
And no pressure. If you feel ignorant, you can write like any basic understanding, or write nothing at all if you feel that you don't know anything at all. Just no pressure in this exercise. Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Just in one sentence, trying to share write down what you understand of what's going on in Sudan, and no pressure if you feel ignorant about the situation, whatever you have to offer. We'll just give everyone like 2 minutes to do that. Thank you for joining us. This feels like an intimate conversation. I like this.
I just want to get you all the permission. Is it okay? I can record you?
Definitely, yeah. Hello, welcome.
Just write down like one sentence that tells you what you know about what's currently going on in Sudan.
Just Tyrone as well. Thank you.
Just in one sentence, write like your understanding of what's going on in Sudan. Currently, no pressure.
And this is anonymous. We'll ask people to share if they want to. Just give me 1 more minute here.
Okay, so hope everybody's ready. I'm just gonna ask for some volunteers, like to share some of your sentences, no pressure, or like some words that you wrote down.
Again, no pressure at all. This advocacy exercise is meant to come to kind of an understanding of what the audience knows about the situation currently. Tyrone?
Well, I came in because I want to learn more about it. I don't have a TV. I don't watch TV. So I keep hearing Sudan being used in the same sentence with genocide and mass murder going on in Yemen and Palestine. So I'm just here to learn more about it.
Thank you
Thank
for sharing that. From back there, would you like to share?
So I don't know if this is again ignorant on my part, but like I don't know if it's something that happened prior. I know Sudan has been ongoing conflict that's been going on, but I know with there was issues in terms of Chad and tribal leaders coming into South Sudan, and there were buffer zones that were split up in water resources, something along those lines. And I know with militarism and the UAE is involved, but the thing is, my problem is I'm trying to connect everything. I'm trying to find the storyline there, but I have bits of ideas with leaderships.
Nice, thank you. This is a place for you. Thank you for coming.
I'll go. Again, probably very ignorant, but I wrote power struggle between armed militias resulting in massive displacements of population.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. In the back. We'll take one more and then we'll move on. Thank you.
In my limited understanding, I've come to understand that I think colonial and neoliberal powers and actors are draining Sudan of its resources, kind of under the guise of fueling civil war and tensions. That's creating mass displacement.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. So we do this advocacy exercise in order to emphasize your elevator pitch on Sudan. It forces you to consolidate when people ask you what is going on. And at the end of this workshop, we'll ask you to flip the card and write down again what your consolidated understanding of what's going on in Sudan. We are not here for a comprehensive theoretical discussions about Sudan. There is definitely a time and space for that. If you would like to have more in-depth discussions, please put your info on the list to join our Decolonize Sudan collective. I would also highly recommend tapping into the Sudanese Resistance Front Committee. They have dialogue weekly and also a weekly book club that we go over the revolutionary charter and many of the key documents within the revolution and have really in-depth discussions there. If you'd like to tap into that collective, please do come to me after. What we are facing in Sudan is dire. The powers that we are up against are well equipped with professional PR and narrative control. The people's resistance needs to be understandable, irresistible, and urgent. So first, before we get into more advocacy exercises, Muna is going to give us brief political context. This will be very brief because there's very little time that we have here, but we'll try to hit kind of the main points of kind of current context.
So what I'd like to start with,
No, this is good. Thank you.
is just setting the groundwork for one of the most important narrative issues here, which is that this is not a civil war. A genocidal militia has violently invaded and is occupying our country. The RSF, Rapid Support Forces, is a private foreign-backed militia led by a war criminal who had his start working up the ranks as a Janjaweed mercenary carrying out the Darfur genocide. Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, that guy in the corner there, he in 2013 restructured the Janjaweed into his own private militia group, the Rapid Support Forces. In 2016, RSF was contracted as mercenaries in Yemen. So that's essentially what they do. They're hired on contracts. It's important to frame that the RSF is a business enterprise that deals in war crimes. They're hired as mercenaries in counterinsurgency campaigns throughout the Middle East and North African region. They were hired by Saudi Arabia to massacre in Yemen, hired by Italy to kill Libyans at the border. They were hired by the EU as border patrol, kidnapping people that were crossing the border. They were also played a very important role in the genocide in Darfur. the RSF has and is continuing to carry out genocide and ethnic cleansing campaigns. They terrorize civilians by occupying and looting their homes. They use rape as a weapon of war, and they use civilians as human shields against the aerial attacks of the army. Dangerously, the RSF is being legitimized by the international community within a two sides narrative. They are occupiers. So we have to understand the difference between this is the Sudanese military and the Rapid Support Forces is that private militia group. So what led us here? In December of 2018, Sudanese workers took to the streets in mass demonstrations calling for higher wages, better working conditions, and lowered prices on food staples. A conglomerate of trade organizations came together, so these were essentially 17 different trade unions, came together as the Sudanese Professionals Association, and they did most of the organizing that was happening at this time. The economic conditions of the Sudanese people were precipitated by decades of terrorism sanctions imposed by the US, essentially starving out the population, in addition to mismanagement under Bashir's regime. So, in response to the union demonstrations, the president at the time, Omar al-Bashir, hired a group of mercenaries as private security. That group was the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, to quell protests and psychologically break any spirits of revolution through cruel and violent tactics. From February until April, the protest demands shifted from better standards of living to regime change, and demonstrations expanded into a larger movement. So by February, the demonstrations had spread throughout the entire country. In April 2019, a coup was led by the military in partnership with the RSF to overthrow the current regime, Omar al-Bashir. Military quelled the mass revolt by promising that military rule was only temporary. So they did this, the RSF and the military, they were essentially saying that this is a democratic transitional council. The US was instrumental in this coup and facilitated the agreement to formally accept military transitional governments. The people of Sudan vehemently opposed this agreement as it only brought them back into military governance. Resistance committees memorialized this opposition with their revolutionary charters. So, from April 2019, protests continued, and the main protest demand became for an end to the military executive governments and a transition, an immediate transition to civilian-led governance. In June 2019, the RSF massacred protests on the last night of Ramadan. Protest organizers were targeted and killed, and as repression and violence against protesters escalated, internet blackouts were a common tactic to silence Sudanese voices. A co-opted civilian group called the Forces for Freedom and Change, or KAHET, claimed to represent civilians and signed the agreement on behalf of the people of Sudan. This move legitimized military presence and recognized the RSF as a separate force. The KAHET civilian group later rebranded as Tegaddum. The agreement claimed that civilian-led democratic transition would begin on April 16th, 2023. The day before, so we're taking a big jump here, okay? In April 16th, 2023, the day before the democratic transition was to take place, seemingly out of nowhere, the RSF militia took over the country, strategically overtaking all key military bases, and for the first time in Sudan's history, invaded the capital. So the RSF was made up of only 10,000 soldiers in Sudan only four short years ago in October 2019. How did this fringe private group of thousands overtake an established national military made up of millions of soldiers? complete the largest mass displacement in history, and occupy a country so strategically within the matter of a year? The answer to this is, of course, external backing. Israel and the UAE provide the bulk of the RSF's arms and funding. They do this in cooperation with other nations as well, including the US, who played a key role in providing diplomatic legitimacy to the RSF. So all of this, it wasn't actually out of nowhere. The RSF was planning for urban warfare, meaning that this is happening within cities where civilians are being a majority of the people that are affected. They were coordinating with foreign powers. They placed soldiers in Khartoum, the capital, buying out the main telecoms agency to prepare for mass blackouts. Beginning as early as 2019, Hemeti hired an Israeli PR firm located in Canada, Dickens and Madsen. This firm was instrumental in mapping out the two sides' civilian war narrative. Civil war narrative. The US is now facilitating peace talks with the militia, so the RSF militia, formalizing the militia's occupation of Sudan. The US has proceeded without any official Sudanese representatives, and now the US and the UAE, among others, are determining the fate of Sudan, stripping Sudanese people of their right to self-determination and legitimizing the occupation of Sudan by the violent foreign militia, the RSF. This is a vital time in which the US is attempting to co-opt civil society organizations to assist in lending legitimacy to the peace talks. Advocates for Sudan, it is important now more than ever that we stay principled and grounded in liberatory demands, now more than ever.
Thank you so much, Mona. Thanks for the context, and thanks for making it so short, all this history and political education. Ahmed is now going to lead us through an exercise called power mapping. Power mapping is an organizing tool to figure out how to achieve movement demands through influencing targets. We will identify our opposition and their motivations, and that will allow us to then identify strategies for shifting power.
Thank you. Next slide. Yeah. So, first of all, actors. These are two main actors. So first we have Hemeti, as mentioned by Mona. He created the RSF as a private militia in 2013.
Oh,
No.
oh, this is the power map. Can you go to the slide before? Thank you. I think if you press proceed anyway, and then
Return to home, yeah.
Return to home, yeah, it should take you back to that.
oh.
Yeah, that's not the rest of it.
Thank you, Chris. I'm sorry.
Press present.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
And thank you for our volunteer who helped to click through slides. We thought it would be like a clicker, so we really appreciate you.
So he created the RSF as a private militia in 2013, and he played a key role in the 2019 Sudanese coup d'etat, and he was behind the transition to civilian military rule, which wasn't truly civilian rule. He led the RSF to invade and take over a lot of Sudan in April 2023, and since April he has funneled millions from extracting the gold mines in Darfur into his privately owned corporations. His ability to leverage Sudanese resources, particularly gold, has led to international alliances and regional influence. Hemeti hired the Israeli PR firm as a part of a larger strategy to secure legitimacy and recognition, portraying the RSF as a force for stability rather than a militia responsible for war crimes and human rights violations. So this is our first actor that will be mentioned, Mohammed bin Zayed. So Mohammed bin Zayed,
If I interrupt really quick,
Yeah.
just to note, Hemeti, the leader of the RSF, is not Sudanese, and most of the RSF are not Sudanese. They are most of them, he has collected child soldiers from the Janjaweed, and also many child soldiers from throughout Chad. This is where most of,
Chad, Central Africa,
and Central
Niger.
Africa.
A lot
That'll
of
be
these through
explained in the
kidnapping
power
as
map.
well.
yes, just to note that this is not a Sudanese force.
Okay, so then with Mohammed bin Zayed, he has realized Sudan is rich in gold. And that resource is largely controlled in that region, specifically the Darfur region, by Hemedti. However, if you pay attention to the Darfur region, all the big gold mines were exasperated completely because Hemedti was using that gold to fund the Russia-Ukraine war by giving that gold to Wagner Group in Russia. So the UAE under Mohammed bin Zayed has become a major looter/buyer of Sudanese gold, and this deepened the economic ties with Hemedti. So the UAE's purchase of Sudanese gold provides crucial financial support to the RSF, helping Hemedti sustain his military operations. So the UAE does not just provide him with money, but they have been supplying Hemedti with weapons to the RSF. And this further strengthens Hemedti's military capabilities. So then bin Zayed's backing of the RSF aligns with the UAE's strategy to assert regional influence, positioning itself as a central player in Sudan's power struggles. The UAE seeks to act as a key mediator in Sudanese politics and the future of Sudanese politics. He's using his influence over the RSF and the control of the gold trade to shape the country's trajectory. So he aims to maintain leverage in Sudan's geopolitical landscape, and he wants the UAE as a key power broker in the country's conflicts and post-conflict reconstruction. So even after this war ends, MBZ will not take his hands off of Sudan. So then next slide, which is power mapping. So if we click on that power map,
And also, again, these resources will all be made available to you at your request. You can also say, like, I don't want to join the collective, but I just want the resources. And we can send you the whole slide, which also contains the power map.
so as you can see, it's a pretty wide source. So if we look at Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who's right here, you can see like a few corporations. We have the Darfur Recovery Fund, Al Junaid Multi-Activities Coalition, the Trad General Trading, and GSK Advanced Company. All these companies are literally just used to take money out of Sudan and put it into his own pockets. So a lot of this is just, so a lot of this is just Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo specifically using his control over Sudanese resources to forge powerful international alliances. So if you look at the connections between Hemedti and, say, if you scroll down, this is Abiy Ahmed, Mohammed Idris, these are all African leaders. So you're wondering, what do these African leaders gain from all this? Well, a lot of these African leaders are usually just puppet states to the West. So what they gain out of this is resources from, say, the US and the West in general. For example, Kenya's current involvement in Haiti. Kenya is nowhere near Haiti. Why are we involved in Haiti? Also, along with this, we see Rwanda and Uganda both playing a force in what's happening currently in Congo. These countries usually just want leverage with the West and access to resources and weapons. So with that, we also see up top Blinken and Biden, if we scroll up. So the US and the UAE have this long-standing partnership, especially after the fallout between Saudi and the US. With that, the UAE has been a key ally in the US efforts to counter terrorism, whatever that means, and combat Iran's regional influence. So Blinken and Biden have sought to expand this relationship, so they have recognized the UAE's ability to act as a stabilizing force and a key player in diplomatic engagements throughout the Middle East. So the UAE is a financial and political supporter of various countries in the Middle Eastern region. We've seen what they've done to Yemen. We've seen what they are currently doing in Palestine by providing rockets to Israel. So Washington wants to maintain a close relationship with the UAE as it's essential to navigating whatever they want to do in the Middle East, which we know what it is. So then, with that, the U.S. and sees Sudan as a region that is right on the Red Sea. If you know about, well, you probably don't know, but Russia has previously wanted to open up a nuclear base on the Sudanese port in Port Sudan. So now the U.S. doesn't want Russia to open up a port, so what are they going to do? They're going to continue destabilizing their country so they can gain access to the port after the RSF takes power along with the UAE. Because the UAE will be the middleman between Sudan and the RSF. Sudan and the US. So then we have the Forces of Freedom and Change at the bottom. The Forces of Freedom and Change have legitimized the RSF, so they should not be recognized as Sudanese civilians or even recognized as people who support democracy in Sudan. They don't know what democracy means. So with that, we see a lot of what's happening in Sudan as them wanting to militarize Sudan to become a puppet state for the US in that region, specifically the Middle East. They'll have easier access to Palestine, they'll have easier access to the Yemen, to the Houthis in Yemen, etc. So yeah, if you look at this map, it shows all the connections from Burhan and his connections, and we can even see that Burhan and Hemeti have a connecting company called Zadna, which was for investments. We also see the House of Saud, which are the Saudis, and we also see Zelensky, who's the Ukrainian president. He actually provides weapons to the SAF, while Russia provides weapons to the RSF. Not Russia specifically, but Wagner Group. So what we see here is just repeated involvement from the West in Sudan. And yeah, I think that's a lot to think of. Is it a lot?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. We hit on so many important points in such a short time. Appreciate it. I think we can move on to political goals and
Yeah.
demands.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Usually the U.S. argues in these situations that if we don't do it, then the other bad people will do it. How do you feel about that?
If
I think
the US isn't the one being there
I think what's
to
funny
destabilize
about
and
it-
it's going to be destabilized anyway by another.
Yeah, that
force.
like Russia is, like we're bad, but Russia is so much worse. And if we leave, we just create a power vacuum for them to, come and take over.
So
I'm just repeating the argument here.
Yeah. I mean, so Russia itself has not been a supporter. I just want to distinguish between Wagner Group, a private militia group, and Russia. Russia itself has not been a supporter of the RSF or the destabilization in Sudan. So I don't know that argument, like factually, would make sense here if there was like an active. And then also, I understand this kind of rhetoric of, but that could be applied anywhere. If the U.S. doesn't invade somewhere, then someone else will eventually invade, and this is part of the colonial kind of mindset of justifying colonialism all over the world. Tyrone?
Yeah, I have a question similar, let me build up here. If this is not a democratically elected government, and this is military how is the United States government justifying the support of a government like that?
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into that a little more within strategic demands, but the United States' position, just like most of its foreign policy globally, is that it is a public mediator. To the public, it facilitates peace talks and ceasefires, but then it is the one facilitating the arms trades to Palestine and to Sudan. This is.
Oh, for example, there's currently the Red Crescent, which is under the Red Cross. The U.S. was crucial in the UAE even allowing the Red Crescent, which is the Red Cross, to open up streets in Sudan to that RSF area. And now, instead of there being humanitarian aid going into Darfur, it's weapons collectively going to the RSF rather than it being humanitarian aid for the people, which is the argument that the U.S. always makes. Oh, we want to help the people. Oh, we are doing what's best for the people. No, they're not.
Yeah,
Right.
and that was a direct result of the peace talks that the U.S. is facilitating and continues to facilitate, is that these humanitarian ports are allowing all these weapons in. So it's not a coincidence that these are being strategically done. We'll talk more about this as well. And also Johnny Harris has a really good video about the humanitarian ports that are opening up and the RSF smuggling weapons in through those ports.
I just wanted to add as well, I think another important justification that the U.S. is using is the war on terror narrative. So the RSF is adopting that narrative, saying that they are fighting Islamism in Sudan. So by them, they can use that as a justification in order to also side with the RSF or whatever side is saying that they're fighting Islamism. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, what are the political goals and demands of Sudanese people? They can be vast and differing. So, some want democracy modeled off of Western democracies. Many want Islamic governance. There are different perspectives around, for example, whether the military should be totally disbanded and reconstructed or reformed. How do we obtain and build up civilian rule with the RSF still at large? Which civilians, during or after the conflict? How would we do this, given that there's no way to obtain true representative governments with most of the population displaced? Elections couldn't be representative of the masses. So although there's different perspectives around these specific things, there's a core set of unifying demands. The first and foremost of that is oust the RSF. A total and permanent withdrawal of the genocidal militia occupying our country is the only way we can move forward. Next is a representative government. So this is leadership that is looking out for the interests of Sudan. They'll not exploit Sudanese resources or succumb to corruption. Leadership that will build strong infrastructure. And another very important demand of the Sudanese people is the rebuilding and reparations. So this includes land being given back for all displaced Sudanese people and the rebuilding of our infrastructure. As an advocate for Sudan, I'm sorry, you had a question?
Oh, no, if you want to continue or like the rest of the slide, I can ask it.
No, you can go ahead.
I was just wondering, in regards to the first demand, like, you say oust the RSF, so who do the Sudanese people, like, by whom, you know what I mean? Like, who do they want to oust the RSF, or like, how?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question here.
I mean, that question is, we feel like if the UAE stops sending weapons to Sudan, or the UAE's involvement is out of Sudan, and the US's involvement specifically, we will be able to oust the RSF, because we are currently battling with weapons from, say, the 1930s, since World War II. As Sudan, as you know, is a country that's pretty underdeveloped, if I use that term, compared to a country like the UAE and the US, who are providing weapons to this new militia with just a few members.
Yeah, like Mona said previously, this is a militia of tens of thousands of soldiers.
Well, they're constantly have new soldiers coming in because there's economic incentives to join the RSF.
Because they're telling people, if you occupy this home, then you can have the home, you can have the resources in it.
Yeah. So if the constant funneling in of weapons and equipment and resources to the RSF were to stop, then the military would realistically be able to overpower them.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question, because we want to stay away from foreign intervention and foreign troops coming into our country. That can be a pitfall, like kind of a trap to fall into. Yeah.
So you're saying, you're saying these aren't just soldiers that are there to get, to do the job they were hired for. They're actually intending on staying behind and occupying.
Yes.
They're incentivized to stay and occupy.
Basically, there's like some new rules in certain areas in Sudan or neighborhoods where they say, oh, if you occupy this home and it's empty because the people left or fled, you can own this home after we win the war.
And one of the first things that the RSF strategically did in April of 2023 when they took over is that they bombed all the land records. So they had this long-term strategy kind of in mind, that homes were to be occupied, the population would be displaced.
So just to clarify, like, the demands on the ground are if the UAE and US and like Western forces, kind of all those power like actors that you mentioned, pull out of involvement and intervention in Sudan, like the Sudanese people will then be able to, like, through people power, through movements, oust the RSF, or are people looking towards the government to be, and like the army to be
The
the
military, currently, there's so many Sudanese civilians who have joined the military to
Mhm.
oust the RSF.
Yes. Yeah.
However, due to the fact that these people are powered by these weapons, we are unable to combat them fully or face on.
Yeah, these are like multi-ton bombs being sent in from Israel. These are like very sophisticated weaponry being sent in from the UAE. So this will require an army to fight off. There have been civilian groups as well, that like independent civilian groups that have risen up that are also fighting back to protect their villages. And I also want to. That's a really important point too, but. Maybe we'll go because of time. Because we have a lot to cover here. Thank you for your question. That was really important.
So as an advocate for Sudan, you have a very important duty. You are entrusted with an amana. The demands you make and the strategies you deploy could make the difference between our movements being sparked or compromised.
Yes, and given the importance of our duty here in our advocacy, we must ensure that we're asking for the right interventions, like some of the questions we've been asking here. Some questions to ask yourself: are you interrogating if you're asking for the right intervention? Are you defining power? Do you know your privilege and understand your positionality within the power structure? For example, we are in America. We are, and thus we are, by that very fact, we are proximate to power. The kinds of demands that we make, therefore, must be more critical. We must be more critical of ourselves to ensure that those demands are reflecting those less proximate to power. This is especially crucial considering the deliberate lack of access to internet and telecommunications tools in Sudan, making it nearly impossible for everyday people to document the abuses that they're facing and broadcast their demands. Are you debating power? Are we having a public conversation about power, or are you just legitimizing and doing a performance? You have to be, in this step, you have to be bold in your platforms and seek transformative change. Are you building power? Does this strategy allow you to build power? Are you disrupting power? Is this an opportunity to disrupt power? Here, you must make it hard for your oppressors to suspend human rights, and therefore, you must never start your demands with concessions. And finally, is your intervention redistributing power? Does this intervention allow you to repair harm and shift away from harming communities? An example of, and I also want to, within this, bring up dual power, because this is always possible, to chip away at the power of the state to cause harm whilst building critical infrastructure under the people's control. You can do both. For example, the Black Panthers, very popular example of active resistance against police forces whilst creating sustainable programming for their neighborhoods to thrive. So now that we've laid that groundwork for questions to ask yourself as an advocate, let's get into practical examples of strategizing around narratives on Sudan. Maybe go back one slide. So one example of what happens when demands are not strategic is in 2019. Many within the U.S. Sudanese diaspora were calling the primary and central demand was Bashir to ICC. That demand focuses, one, on an individual rather than institutions, so it's not a call for transformative change. We must also recognize that this is a demand for foreign intervention, for other states to step in and arrest our president at the time, which it's a legitimate demand, but without any demands or vision for the process of succession, this created a power vacuum that external entities backing the RSF easily jumped into to destabilize, as well as backing our military to conduct a coup in order to destabilize the region. So that's an example of what happens maybe when the demand, we don't interrogate our demands. Maybe we'll move to, so one common phrase that we see around Sudan now is eyes on Sudan. This is a perfectly fine appeal, but it is ambiguous. It does not present any demands or narrative context. An alternative appeal is hands off Sudan. This has a clear goal of fighting against foreign meddling, the main element that is keeping our occupation alive. Another example here is the Civil War narrative and opposing military generals. We've laid the context that this is not opposing military generals. This is a private militia taking over the land. And people have criticisms of the military, which revolutionary forces and resistance committees will handle once the RSF is ousted from our country. So the Civil War narrative does not distinguish between parties. It also does not distinguish between actions. The RSF is explicitly targeting civilians, whilst the military is targeting the destabilizing force with disregard for civilian casualties. And also, when you say this, we have to be critical of our language. When we're saying opposing military generals or civil war, we are legitimizing the RSF as a military. And what military is the RSF, what military does that belong to? You're saying that this is a Sudanese military. So if you are standing by this, you are conceding the demand that the RSF be ousted from power. You're giving the RSF legitimacy and power. So we're starting with a concession there. An alternative and the reality of what is happening is a narrative around occupation. Did you notice how within this presentation we are very intentional about calling the RSF a militia? This is within this context, we can talk about the dangers of private militias here and globally. I think a really pertinent example of that domestically is if, let's say, Trump or Elon Musk were to hire Wagner Group or Blackwater to take over an entire country. That is, an extremely dangerous prospect, a very possible prospect also. But we can talk about kind of the dangers of private militias within and how it applies to our domestic context when we reframe in this way. Next one is peace talks. This is an important one because it is urgent. This demand treats the RSF as a legitimate state entity and formalizes their occupation in Sudan. The RSF is a non-state actor, it's a private militia. Second, we have to think about the strategic effectiveness of this demand. It is a demand that starts with the concession. Even if, so let's say that the demand were to be, so this is actually about the ceasefire, so I'll actually come down here. So in this context, it's extremely pertinent that we ask who is facilitating these peace talks and what are the terms of the peace agreement. In this case, the peace talks that are ongoing are US created and facilitated agreements that have only opened up routes such as the Adre border, where the RSF smuggles in weapons en masse, like we discussed earlier. The people that the US has in the boardrooms where these peace talks are being had are the main providers of the RSF's weapons and the RSF. This is what the boardroom looks like where the peace talks are happening. By facilitating these peace talks, the US is playing public peacekeeper whilst facilitating weapons transfers. And the terms, of course, of these peace talks are that routes such as the Adre border are opened up for weapons to then be smuggled in. Again, Johnny Harris has a really great video on this, talking about routes that they're nowhere near civilian areas. They only go towards RSF bases. So there's no reason to open up that route except to provide weapons to the RSF. And this is the kind of agreements that the US are facilitating. An alternative appeal is permanent withdrawal of the RSF from Sudan. And if our immediate goal is to oust the RSF from power, the international community must delegitimize this power, not as a formal state power that can be negotiated with. Next demand that I'll speak about is ceasefire. So ceasefire is one of those buzzwords that gets passed around a lot, but we don't really understand what this demand entails. Similar to the peace talks demand, we need to think about the strategic effectiveness of this particular intervention. If the demand were to be met, and the RSF, along with its military, with the military, stopped aerial and ground combat, which the RSF would never do. Their power is derived solely from violence. What would that do for the Sudanese people? The RSF would continue to occupy the land and continue to terrorize civilians, and the majority of the population would remain displaced. Rather, we can shift to a targeted arms embargo of the RSF. There would be no need for a ceasefire because an arms embargo could disrupt the flow of weapons, will disrupt the flow of weapons, and contribute to reduction of civilian casualties. So as I mentioned, the bulk of RSF weapons are snuck in through diverting aid trucks. A ceasefire would disproportionately affect the Sudanese military much more than it would the RSF, even if the RSF were to follow the agreements of a ceasefire agreement. So the next one is one that we've also touched on. Let in humanitarian aid. This is the universal call that the US loves to call for these days. We're just letting in humanitarian aid. Why isn't the military letting in this aid? There are such human rights abusers. We have to carefully assess why the Sudanese military is blocking convoys from certain routes. The US has been working hand in hand with its defense partner, the UAE, to bring in weapons through RSF-controlled routes. Most recently, the US has been able to expand RSF-controlled routes into Sudan through this particular, pushing this particular demand. There are some civilian groups that are legitimizing this demand because, frankly, a lack of understanding of what it entails. Because it sounds great to let in humanitarian aid, but which routes, what is the, and how are we preventing a diverting of the aid, which has been the primary form of smuggling, the RSF getting in weapons into Sudan. An alternative demand there is stop arming the RSF. What we need is not conditional aid that has been strategically leveraged to further entrench Sudan into war. We need a stop to the foreign meddling that keeps the RSF militia able to occupy and terrorize our land.
So now, we're at the end, y'all.
At the end.
But one last thing, I want you to flip those note cards over, those index cards over, and write in the bag, what do you now understand of what is going on in Sudan? Did it change or did it remain the same? Your thoughts from the beginning.
Oh, that's because it's on and we do this.
So Amal is going to pass around the sign-up sheet for our collective or for resources around our collective. You can just make an X if you don't want to be part of the email list or collective itself. And then if you would like, we would love your note cards if you could place them into that manila folder.
Does anyone want to share their?
Oh yeah, if anyone wants to share it, so. Yeah. But we would love, just for our own, like informing our own work, we would love kind of the feedback of your narratives. Yes, there we go.
One thing I would like to say is very great presentation, you all. Certainly, a whole lot more educated on Sudan's crisis and America's complicity. But I wanted to make a particular note about the last part about the narrative and the demand. Always remember that power conceives nothing without demand. It never has and it never will. So even in those moments where the fight or the struggle seems just unbearable, unbeatable, you still make your demand. You still make sure that you are intentional, as you pointed out, about who the actors are and what they are actually doing in their inhumanity, their barbarism. Because if you don't do it, then it just continues. It has to be a certain point where someone makes a stand, and you have to be intentional about that, and you have to make demands. Because if you don't make a demand, power will never concede it.
Exactly.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions as well?
Is there like a leader or like a political group or party that folks want to kind of take over after they are able to remove the militia?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So first, the Tajammun, the initial group of trade union organizations that was organizing much of the protests initially, is a very trusted group. Many of this group were killed off, targeted and killed off by the RSF and the militia. But also many in Tajammun were involved in, as well as other groups were involved in revolutionary charters. So there were two revolutionary charters that came out of Khartoum and of Medani, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the groups that formed these charters, constructed these core demands and worked with the resistance committees throughout Sudan to form these demands at the time that were that we need civilian-led governance. We don't want military executive leadership, and we certainly at the time would not want a militia occupation. So these demands that were formed by the Revolutionary Charter, both the Revolutionary Charters, I think, are key to. There's a lot of consensus around them. These two revolutionary charters were. This is a very interesting thing. So the democracy. What is that democracy group? So Kahad, the co-opted civilian group, then took these two agreements and formed this new agreement of transitionary council, working with this American organization, actually, an American NGO called the Democracy. I forgot what it's called, but it's Change something. But they worked. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they're an organization that push American democratic values on like the rest of the world. They mostly target African nations, but they're essentially furthering America's interests.
Mm-hmm. So Kahad, which it's evolved into Taqaddum, or just rebranded into Taqaddum. Like many distrust this organization, which is also, as Emil brought up, actually yesterday you brought this up, how all of the members of Kahad are not actually in Sudan. Many are not Sudanese, and some are, and most are like within diaspora working with this NGO, NGO, and so this is a group that's really not trusted, but it has been the only civilian group that the U.S. has been working with, surprisingly.
What's funny is, as soon as the war broke out, they were the first people to take out their passports and did.
Yeah, and then they immediately started working with the RSF as soon as they invaded. And so this is really not a trusted civilian group. So when you see the name
Taqaddum, Forces for Freedom and Change, or the
FFC, any of that,
this group is a front for like civilian leadership, legitimacy of the kind of. Oh, we've consulted with civilians. We have Taqaddum with us. Yeah.
Also, another issue that we've seen with them is the ones that did remain in Sudan have worked closely with the RSF to say, oh, okay, this group of people, they're working with the military, go in, those people are later on killed, which is why we saw a lot of people with takaddum, like the previous one, not the one now, but the ones who were actually good and cared for the civilians, killed off or assassinated as soon as the war started. Any other questions? Yeah.
So what do you guys see as, do you see this expanding outside of Sudan if things continue and escalate in the way that it is within the greater like African regions and because I mean, we have a lot of leaders that are involved, like you mentioned, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Kenya also being involved, you know, all these leaders. So how do you see it, like if things go the wrong way, like how do you see it expanding?
I can explain this because we've seen the RSF as a whole take over certain countries. For example, the RSF was started by Gaddafi in Libya in the 70s to take over Chad. They did take over Chad, which was the easiest way into Sudan currently. But they also took over Mali and Niger and Central Africa a while ago. But they aren't labeled as the RSF, they're labeled as a nomadic group, which leads to issues of, like, for example, a lot of them are camel herders. Usually they steal
Like
the camel or etc. from the actual natives of the land and then take them back home or to whatever their camp is set up. So what we see is now if the RSF is continuously provided weapons, just like at the EU border currently, where they're provided weapons to protect the borders or whatnot, we see that it could escalate to the point of no return at this point. Right.
Yeah, like we mentioned, like the RSF is a private militia that has been hired on by Saudi Arabia, by Italy, by the EU to destabilize countries within the Northeast and Middle Eastern regions. So this is a militia that will continue. I mean, Hamidi will go after the dollar. He'll go after whoever will give him the highest contract, the highest pay. I think he's now shifting to kind of the political arena because of, in order to avert consequences for the many abuses that he has committed within Sudan. But this is a private militia group that will not be limited to Sudan. Yeah. I think it poses also a question about private militias at large. Like, there are no accountability measures, there are no human rights accountability measures, no state accountability measures for these kind of transnational private militias. This is a really this is a kind of hope. It's just a question that we should be really thinking about.
Also, what we saw is like the looting of the Sudanese National Museum and the looting of one of the largest irrigation projects in the world, which is the Al Jazeera project, which provided cotton and agriculture to not just Africa, but the Middle East and other countries in the West as well, because Sudan was known as the breadbasket of the world.
Yeah.
So if they looted Sudan of these resources, what else could they do to other countries surrounding Sudan?
Yeah, and that's a really good point about the agricultural depletion in Sudan is affecting the economies of so many economies around Sudan. So this is definitely not isolated.
Yeah, the prices of everything in Egypt and Ethiopia, etc., have skyrocketed because livestock and agriculture directly was coming out of Sudan. Also, Sudan was the only country to print money out. For example, we printed out money for Somalia, etc. So with that, there's a lack of even money, and there's now rise in inflation in the countries surrounding us, as the RSF has looted.
How is South Sudan involved? Is South Sudan affected by this at all?
It is affected due to the fact that the RSF has been kidnapping people from South Sudan to bring into the military or the militia.
Yeah, and so like recently, the South Sudanese leader has been like more of an ally with the military to try to fight the RSF. Yeah, especially due to like how it's affecting his own civilians. We have to go because the session is over, but please do put your information into the list, and we will send any resources to you, and we'd love to have you within the collective to continue these conversations. Appreciate y'all for showing up. Thank you.